It was the late 70s. I was 18. I was standing by the side of a road in Canada in a blue, circular, uncrushable skirt, holding a sign that said, "The Border." I was a very long way from home. And I was about to put my thumb out for the first time. I was going to hitchhike for the very first time, and I was terrified. Now, you might ask how I got into this situation. Well, I blame it all on my mother. When I was an adolescent, many people would say that my mother and I were mirror images of each other, and you can imagine I hated that. I mean, what adolescent wants to be likened to their mother? But I had to admit that there were a few things we had in common, and one of them was a love of adventure. My mother's favorite phrase was, "No guts, no glory." Well, she was brought up in Liverpool in England, and when she was 14, the Second World War broke out. And England stayed at war until she was 20, and then there were severe restrictions after that in England, and rationing for many years after that. And so my mother said her best years, her best adventuring years, had been eaten up by the war and by the aftermath. And so she was determined she was going to claw those years back in any way that she could. And one of the main ways she decided was that she was going to live vicariously through me. And so when other mothers were encouraging their daughters to study, to go to college, to get a good career behind them, my mother was saying to me, "Geraldine," she said, "you're reading too much, you're studying far too much, put that books down, you need to go out and party." And then when other mothers were encouraging their children not to stray far from home, my mother was encouraging me into adventures. And so when I was 18, I told her that I was going to go to Montreal to see the Olympic Games with my boyfriend. We were going to backpack, and then we were going to hitchhike to New York, and we would fly back from New York to Europe. Well, I expected, I wanted my mother to be like other mothers and forbid me to go, because of course that meant that I wouldn't be able to go, and I'd be able to blame her. But of course, my mother was my mother, and she said, "Darling, would you like me to help you pack?" And so it meant I had to go. Now, it must be said that she didn't know my boyfriend, and my boyfriend was very respectable. His name was Ivor, and he was 5 years older than I was, and he'd graduated from Cambridge the year before, and he'd just got his English bar finals, so that meant that he was set to be a lawyer, a barrister. And I was very smitten with this man. I just thought he was quite gorgeous. In fact, I thought of him as a blonde-haired Rhett Butler with a mild case of acne. And of course, I was the fearless, feisty Scarlett O'Hara. A little tubby for Scarlett, but still Scarlett nonetheless. And Ivor had travelled a lot, and he'd hitchhike a lot, and he explained the rules of the road. He said, "Geraldine," he said, "you always travel in good clothes." He said, "You need an uncrushable skirt, and I need a lightweight jacket." He said, "Because then you'll get a better class of ride." He said, "And then you never get in a car where you're outnumbered. It's best if there's one, two if they don't look very strong, but certainly not three, because they can overpower you and kill you." Well, I have a very vivid imagination. I was immediately seeing myself thrown from some car, dead, mutilated, outside some exotic American city like Akron. And so I was very worried the first time I put my thumb out, and I was very grateful when lots of cars passed us by. But then this decrepit two-door, ancient, rusted-out Chevy stopped, and I looked inside, and there was a middle-aged man there, and he had long, unkempt, greasy hair, and he had a missing front tooth, and he had grime etched in his laugh lines. And he said, "I can take you 40 miles. And Ivor said, "Thank you, sir, we'll take it." And he got in the back seat with the backpacks. And as he got in, he said to me, "You get in the front, you talk to him, you're good at talking." So despite my misgivings, I had to get in. Well, of course, I immediately reached for the seatbelt, and it wasn't there. And the man said, "No," he said, "the seatbelt dropped off some time ago." Well, that car looked like a rusted-out jalopy, but goodness knows what he had under the engine, because we went from 0 to 80 in seconds, and I was flung back in the seat because of the acceleration. And then he was driving at 80, and he only had one hand on the steering wheel because he was chain smoking. And he would light the other cigarette with the burning stub of the other one. And he didn't have an ashtray. He didn't need an ashtray. Because right there, by the gear shift, there was a huge rusted out hole that went down to the road. And he just flicked the ash down there and then threw the still burning cigarettes. Well, I was just watching that hole. I expected one of those cigarettes to catch fire and the car to explode. I was waiting for that when the man said, "I've got a glass eye. Would you like to see it?" And he took out the eye and he put it on my shoulder. Well, I stayed very still because I didn't want it to fall off. I didn't want it to go into my lap or by my feet. I didn't want him going for it. And so I didn't quite know what to say. I mean, you know, what's the protocol when you've got a glass eye? And I just, well, that's fascinating. And that seemed to do the trick because he didn't say anything else until he dropped us off. And he kept both eyes on the road after that, which I was very pleased about, even though they were 3 feet apart. Well, Ivor was right about dressing nicely because we got lots of good rides, and we got one. An old couple dropped us in the countryside outside of Cleveland, and it was quite late in the evening, but we only had 18 miles to go, and we were going to stay in the next town. We'd already picked out a youth hostel. But it was getting a bit dark, and Ivor said, well, he said, no one's going to pick us up once it gets dark. We're going to have to start walking. And we'd stayed there quite a long time, but it was a quiet road, and the cars had just passed us by. Well, then, just after Ivor had said that, a huge, great red pickup truck stopped. But the only thing is, there were 3 men in the cab. And I said, well, we can't get in that, Ivor, because that breaks the rules of the road. And he said, well, they're in the cab, and they'll put us in the back. He said, I think just on this occasion it will be all right. So we got back in the flatbed, and the only thing that was back there was a white cooler full of beer, it turned out. Because the men kept saying to Ivor, pass us some of that beer. And Ivor was passing beer through the windows, and all 3 men were sucking down the suds, including the driver. And the whole cab was filling up with empties. Well, I was trying really hard not to think about the danger of drinking and driving when I saw that there was a man hitchhiking. It was an itinerant worker who'd come out to the fields at the end of the day, and they stopped to pick him up. And then there were others, and they stopped to pick them up, and in the end there were 8 men in the back of that truck besides Ivor and I. I mean, one of them was so close to me. I mean, we were all squished together, but I thought this man was going to have to be surgically removed from my body. He was so close, and then he was really staring at me, and then he pulled up his trouser leg, and I saw that he had a knife attached to his ankle. Well, I looked over at Ivor, my rep butler, and he hadn't noticed. He was reading. He was completely oblivious. And I thought about his skill set that had seemed quite magnificent in London. But I wasn't absolutely sure that if a rumble went down in the back of this truck, would he be able to defend me? And then I started to think, what happens if they've all got weapons attached to their ankles? And then I thought, I think they do. And I looked at one, and I thought, he's got a gun. And another one, he's got a steel pipe. And another one, he's got rope and a candlestick, I know it. And I could just see the headline the next day. Miss Scarlett found dead inside the library, bludgeoned to death with a spanner, with a wrench. I just knew it. I was so grateful when they dropped us off, and I could say goodbye, wave goodbye to those tail lights. Well, my mother, she loved hearing about the adventures, particularly the hitchhiking. But everything was turned on her a few years later. My whole relationship with Ivor had wound down, and I was at Bristol University, and it was coming up to the summer, and I felt I was in a rut. And so I'd got some money for my 21st birthday, and I said, Mother, I've decided I'm going to go by myself on a bus to India. And my mother, this time, she did say, oh, no, you're not. Now, every child knows how to press their mother's buttons. And my mother was a truly wonderful woman, but I loved her incredibly, but she was perhaps just a little tiny wincy bit of a snob. And so I said to her, Mother, you have a choice. I either stay in Bristol and marry somebody really provincial, or I go to India. Without hesitation, my mother said, darling, book your ticket. Well, again, I wanted her to be like other mothers, to completely forbid me so I could tell her that she had ruined my life. But no, I went to India. Well, what I didn't know, and I didn't know this for years later, was that my mother had done a deal with God. she said, Lord, if you send angels to look after my daughter on that bus, I will pick up every hitchhiker that I see this summer. And my parents lived in the south coast of Spain, near the busiest road in Europe, and all summer, my mother would go skidding across 2 or 3 lanes of traffic. Every time she saw hitchhikers, she'd throw open the door and she'd beckon them into the cool cream leather interior of her late model Jaguar. They were very, very surprised. But she kept her side of the bargain, and the Almighty kept his, because that bus turned out to be the bus from hell. And I can't really tell you about it tonight, but it is on my CD, Go to CD Baby, Destination Slammer. But it was a dreadful trip. But there was a group of men who did look after me. They tucked me under their wing, and they were really like angels. But not the kind of angels that my mother had prayed for. After all, this was the bus from hell. It was a group of hell's angels. And no one will ever be able to tell me that the Almighty does not have a sense of humor. Well, just before she died, which was 16 years ago, my mother said to me, "Oh, Geraldine," she said, "because of you, I've had some lovely adventures." And of course, I was delighted. But then I also started to think about that, because I always thought that it was my mother who'd pushed me into adventures. And then I remembered that we were mirror images of each other. And sometimes you need to look into a mirror to discover and then to remember who you really are. Thank you.